Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. My name's Louise May, and I'm the Director of Product Management at Product Focus. Before we start with the webinar, let me tell you a little bit about Product Focus. We're the leading product management training organisation in Europe, and we've now been operating for 18 years. We offer world-class training for product professionals at all stages of their careers. Our essentials range of courses includes our flagship course, Product Management and Product Marketing. It's a great foundation course for new product managers, or a really strong refresher course for more experienced product managers. The Advanced Practitioner suite of courses supports product managers as they advance throughout their career. And our two latest courses are Driving Product Growth and AI-powered Product Management. Both are receiving great reviews. Finally, our leading product management course is for product leaders who are already leading a department. We have an excellent Trustpilot score of 4.8, which gives you a reassuring indication of the high quality of our training. So feel free to ask questions in the chat box. I'll be in the background answering your questions. No one else can see your questions, only me, so I'll respond privately to you. And then in the Q&A session at the end, I'll read some of your questions out and Aidan can answer them for you. So I am now handing over to Aidan Dunphy, one of our senior consultants who's leading today's webinar. Thanks, Aidan.
Thanks, Louise. So just very quickly to introduce myself, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. That's me. I've been working in product for, it says 28 years here, but I still am, of course. I'm actively involved in a number of different product initiatives right now, mainly in software, but also in recent years in some hybrid projects which involve hardware, electronics, and software. And I also work as an advisor to startups and to some small and medium-sized businesses. So I come from a maths background and engineering background, so I came from the technical route, but have actually spent most of my career in market-facing roles. So that's enough about me. So the tool that we're using today is Livestorm. So if you want to zoom in a bit, you can maximize the slide window using the button highlighted on this graphic, and you can hide the Q&A panel as well if you want to get a better look at the slide that we have in view. And also, at any time, you can download a PDF of this presentation from, if you click on Apps and then look for the Handouts app, and you should see a pane like that appears, and you can download from there. Okay. All right, so let's get into it. So today I'm going to be talking about products, services, platforms, and solutions, and what do these things mean? So the three takeaways I would like you to have at the end are: I want to talk about why this is a problem, or what problems can arise from vagueness in terminology that we use. I'm going to spend most of the talk going through those four terms in the title and setting out what I believe to be a nice, clear way of thinking about these different terms that will be useful to you and your business. And then finally, I want to spend a few minutes talking about how you can really take charge of this and sort it out in your business, and indeed, why should you? Okay. So first up, so what are the problems that we are trying to address here? Well, I'm sure you've heard the word jargon, right? I think in every industry has its own jargon. And it's often used in a pejorative sense, so I mean a negative sense, as if it's like some kind of secret language that we use to exclude others and to make us look clever. But I think, to be fair, it's actually something that's very useful, and it's there for a reason, right? We invent these terms because it's shorthand, right? It's a shorthand for sometimes quite technical concepts or very domain-specific concepts. And so if you had to explain everything in common everyday language every time you try to express something to your colleagues, it would take much longer, right? So we use jargon to shortcut that process. We make assumptions that the people we are communicating with understand the same jargon, and so we don't need to explain it all every time. Now, just a bit of fun here. I'm sure you've seen heard of the business bingo card. There's sometimes a rude word in that. And the old joke that there are these meaningless business terms that people use, and the idea is that you sit with your bingo card and toss them off in a meeting and chuckle to yourself about all the empty jargon that's being used. But the truth is, as I say, I think this stuff is really useful and saves a lot of time. Or does it? Well, it might, but are you incorrectly assuming that your colleagues have the same definitions as these terms? And I think that the answer very often is no, they don't, right? So I'm going to go through that in the second part of the presentation. So this bingo card here has a bunch of words on it that I'm sure you recognize. I'm sure you probably use some or all of these terms on a regular basis. So if you fancy actually having a go at trying this game, you can scan that QR code, or you can see the URL on the page there. So it's from Bingo Baker, which is a website where you can make your own bingo card. So I made this one. So there's a little takeaway for you. Now, the downside of trying to define terminology sometimes is that your colleagues may think you're being very pedantic or controlling, or indeed they may get defensive about the terminology that they use if you're trying to challenge that or change it. Okay, so I'll talk a little later about how do you overcome that. Now, there are a lot of problems associated with unclear terminology, and I just want to go through a few of them. So here's an example. This is a real photograph from a UK store. So this is Whiskers, which is a famous brand in the UK of cat food and associated products. And they felt the need. Did they really need to put a sign up saying this isn't produced by cats? This is for cats to consume. Now, I have to assume that notice is there for a reason, right? So did Whiskers make a mistake in calling this cat milk? It's just a slightly extreme example, but it does show that it's amazing how people can misinterpret what you think is a very obvious statement. Here's a more subtle example of where I think business terminology wasn't clearly understood. You may recognize this product. This is a product called the Humane AI Pin. It was a product that was launched, I think, about 2 years ago. And the idea was that it was an AI assistant for which you didn't need a smartphone. It had its own embedded AI model. Because it didn't have a screen or a keyboard or anything like that, to interact with it, you interacted with it through your speech. But when you needed to see text or to control what it was doing, it would project an image onto your hand using a little laser display, and then you could move your hand to different hand gestures would interact with the device in different ways. Now, you look at this, and if you haven't seen this product before, I'd be quite curious as to what you think about this. But Marques Brownlee, who is arguably the world's most famous product reviewer, his working title is MKBHD. He described it as the worst product I've ever reviewed. Right? Why? Well, because basically it was solving problems that people didn't have. Right? It was very unclear what the value proposition of this product actually was. Right? It was undoubtedly very clever, but why would anybody want this, really? Right? And I would argue, I think that the reason such a terrible product gets launched, and I think something like $600 million was blown on this company. I think the main reason fundamentally was just a basic error in understanding how to formulate propositions, right? And so people confuse clever technology with useful solution, right? So we'll talk more about that as we go on. All right. Also, we see a lot of costly commercial mistakes that actually happen purely as a result of vague communication within a business. So, having a bit of fun with salespeople here. Actually, my first job was a sales job, selling door to door, and I've managed sales teams, so I know what it's like. But if you have people working in your sales team who don't really understand what your products do, what products you have, why they're good, then they're going to have to make it up, basically, right? They have to have something to say, right? And so they'll say they'll fill the void with their own assumptions about what the products are, right? So a saying that somebody said to me early in my career is, put words in people's mouths, or they'll make them up for you, right? Also, how do you price products? How can you really articulate the value of a product if you haven't really understood what it is and why its proposition is useful, right? So I think it's very important to have really good rigor around defining these things. So I want to give you a story about something that happened to me earlier in my career that had a very dramatic effect on the pricing of the product. So it was about 20 years ago, I think. We launched a product in the UK. It was a software product aimed at the social housing market in the UK. I worked for a company that was very successful in that market. And we were the first to market with a product that enabled tenants in social housing to manage their rent account, to communicate with their landlord via a website for the first time. Now, this was launched in, actually, I think it was 2003, so it was very, very early for that market. Now, it was a little too early to market, and our salespeople didn't really understand what it was. And one day I became aware that one of our sales guys had sold it, they'd thrown it into a deal with a very prestigious, high-profile UK social housing authority in London. The overall deal was £8 million, and he threw in this product for £2,500. Now, when I discovered this, I also knew that this product was strategically important to that organization, and to them, it was worth many millions of pounds in savings every year, right? And now we did manage to renegotiate that with the client because they understood that it was a mistake. But really, this happened because I think the sales, I don't want to blame the sales guy. I'm going to blame myself because I don't think I helped him enough to understand what this thing was, what it did, why it was useful, right? So, and more to the point, he just thought that it was just another module, right? And this was, so he had applied the usual terminology that we applied to new bits of software that we developed, and that led to an assumption that it was just something that was going to cost a few £1,000s. So, and I'll come back to that point as we go on. Another very common problem, which I'm sure you've experienced in communication within companies, is when you need to estimate work, and most usually in engineering or software engineering, right? So I'm sure you've heard this expression before. Oh, I thought you meant ... when actually you meant something much more expansive. Here's another example from my career. So I worked for an agency for a few years, and we built bespoke software for all kinds of companies all over the world. This particular one was a company based in Kuala Lumpur, if I remember rightly, and they were in the education space. They ran international schools all over the planet, and they came to us asking for what we thought was an app. Essentially, we thought that it was a tool for interacting with parents, so that schools could use to manage their communications with the parents of the children who were at the school. Whereas, in fact, what the customer really wanted was a comprehensive schools management system. Now, this did not come to light until some way through the first phase of the project, right? Because the client, we kept showing the client things like this, and then the client was eventually started to become a bit nervous and say, when do I see some dashboards? And then it started to transpire that there had been, again, a gross misunderstanding about what the word system meant, right? So again, I'm not going to blame the client here, right? No, this was very much our fault. This was a failure on our side, really, to control the conversation and to ensure that everybody had the same understanding. Maybe you've had similar experiences, right? By the way, before I move on, one thing I'll say is if you're involved in software development, this is why you should always do backlog refinement meetings, and I would do them every sprint. So always discuss what your requirements are with the whole team verbally, so that there can't be any doubt. Now, I've already mentioned a couple of times that I took the blame for this, or that I blame myself, right? I take responsibility for these things, right? Well, why is that? Because because I felt that it was my responsibility, that I was accountable for ensuring the useful and correct and helpful communication between the different parties, between the salespeople, between engineering, between clients, between marketing people, and so on, right? So this tool that you're looking at here, this is probably our most famous tool. This is our product activities framework, and it gathers together all of the activities that we think should be happening in a product business. We divide them into strategic activities at the top there, and we also have inbound activities, which are all about creating products, and outbound, which are all about getting the products out there. So launching them, promoting them, helping to sell them. And you can use this tool with your colleagues to help to identify where there are gaps or crossovers or vague areas of accountability where it's not commonly agreed who is actually accountable for one of these activities. Now the point I want to make really is this really starts with terminology, right? If you can't define what a product is, how can you possibly hope to define what product management is? And I would say, I personally think this is the biggest problem that product management has, right? That it all stems from ambiguity about what product actually means, right? And so when you then start trying to explain product management and to establish that in a business, you're falling at the first hurdle very often, okay? So I'm going to come on to that, right? I want to spend really now some time talking about these words in a bit more depth. And so what do they actually mean? I want to offer you some definitions, right? I'm going to start with the product word. I mean, this is the one that we use all the time, and I'm sure you've heard it defined in many different ways. Now, we run, we have a number of different courses that Louise mentioned earlier, and probably our most popular is our product management and product marketing course, which is our kind of flagship training course that covers the whole of the discipline. And very early in that course, we discussed this point. It's one of the first things we talk about. And I'll say to a room full of people, can anybody please give me a definition of what is meant by the word product? Now, usually the first answer I will get from somebody is something that we sell, right? And I'll say, well, yeah, okay, that might well be true, okay? But there is an issue with that, or a number of issues with that, because you can sell things that aren't products, right? You could sell products that don't exist. Also, it might lead to a thought that the purpose of products is purely to generate revenue, right? Now, there's a number of issues with that, right? I mean, they're all partially true, I suppose. The next most common response that we get is something tangible, at which point I will say to people, okay, I can understand why you say that, because when you say the word product, people tend to think about things like a smartphone or a packet of soap powder or something. But then I say, well, so software can't be a product then, because it's not tangible. And at that point, the room normally goes quiet because nobody knows what to say. They're a bit stumped. So I want to offer you some characteristics of products, right? These are, I think, rather like, if you've ever studied biology at school, what are the characteristics of a living thing? Well, here are the characteristics of a product, right? It has a clear proposition, and you can describe up front what outcomes it will generate, right? It has a pattern of repeatable elements. So there's something that can generate value in a predictable way, right? And for which it is mainly or entirely the same for every customer. So it doesn't require tailoring each time. It probably contains intellectual property, which is important for a reason I'll come on to in a moment. And it is cheaper to produce each one than if you were creating a bespoke solution every time, which means that you can generate much higher margins than bespoke solutions, because you can just stamp out, 1 million copies of something rather than having to invent it 1 million times. And finally, it has a life cycle. So, one day this product may mature and then it may decline, right? So it requires management. It is a long-lived concept. What about service then? Oh, before I move on to that, I'll say, well, I mentioned earlier that there are these questions that people ask during the training course, and a very common one that people then come to is, can a service be a product? Because we often get companies on the course who are service-based businesses, right? And I would say that the answer is, well, yes, but really it needs to have the characteristics that we see on the screen here, right? You need to try to productize the service, all right? And most of the time services aren't really like this. So what are services like? Well, to try to explain the difference between a product and a service, if we're going to get very, precise about this, right? So imagine a classic product, right? This is a product that is the same every time. I want you to think about a Snickers bar, all right? So if now most people in the world know what a Snickers bar is, right? It's sold in every continent. And if you go to buy a Snickers bar in your country, you can be pretty sure that it will be the same as the last Snickers bar that you bought in that country, right? It's an optimized mix of chocolate, peanuts, caramel, and nougat, right? Which most people like. Not everybody, but most people do. Now, because they've found this formula, it means that they can make many millions of Snickers bars in exactly the same way, which makes it very inefficient. It keeps the marginal cost of production down, and that means that they can make high margins, sales margins, when it comes to sales time. Now, compare this with, oh, and by the way, I should say, imagine that you tried to get a custom Snickers bar. Imagine if you wanted a Snickers bar that had pecan nuts instead of peanuts. Now, you could do that, but how much would that cost you, right? So if a Snickers bar cost you, let's say, I don't know, €2, right? Imagine how much would it cost you to get a bespoke Snickers bar made? A lot more than €2, I would venture to suggest, right? Now compare this with a classic service. Now, if you can see me on the camera, you'll know, you probably guess that I don't go to hair salons very often, but when I did, when I was a younger man, I wanted a haircut that suited my style, that suited my hair, such as I had, and the shape of my head, and so on, right? I didn't want a boilerplate, so to speak, haircut that was exactly the same as everybody else, like the Snickers bar idea. So when you get a haircut, you expect to get a bespoke service. It's just for you, right? Now, there might be some standardized hairstyles and common trends, but the hairdresser is going to tailor it for you, and every customer will get a slightly different or very different result. Imagine you went to a hair salon that could only do one hairstyle. Would you accept that? I doubt that very much. Now, why is this so important? Well, because look at these two lines, right? These show the very simplified view of the growth of different types of business. So the green line represents product companies and the red line represents service-based companies. So the thing about service-based companies is as they grow, their costs tend to grow proportionately. So to use the hairdresser example, if you wanted to do twice as many haircuts, you would have to employ twice as many hairdressers. So your costs go up as you scale your delivery, right? Proportionately. However, with a product, your cost doesn't rise anywhere near as quickly. So to make the 10,001st Snickers bar, right, will cost you a very small amount of extra money, right? The difference being that to set up the machinery and to do the research and to formulate the Snickers bar at the beginning, that was costly, and that's why the green line starts below the line, right? So you, with a product-based business, you have to invest up front, right? And you might lose all of that money, as we talked about the humane AI pin earlier. But what you hope is that you won't lose all of your money and that it will catch on, that you have correctly addressed the needs and desires of a significant part of the market, and that you will be able to sell and sell and sell the same thing, more or less the same thing, and keep selling it and shoot off up, as we see the green line doing there, that your profits will rise and rise and rise, right? Now, this is this is obviously a simplified view, but it's a general rule of thumb that product-based businesses with intellectual property are valued at 10 times the rate of service-based businesses for that reason, right? Because intellectual property, the design that you own, the brand that you have, the customers you have, that represents potential future sales at low marginal cost. So this is why, fundamentally, why companies try to adopt the product model, is because it's about profitability. All right, so, and very often you'll see, I touched on this earlier, service-based businesses are often trying to productize. They're trying to identify what are the things that we do that are usually the same and that we can repeat and make more efficient and thereby lower the cost of delivery in order to become more profitable. Typically, you might do that through standardizing processes and producing documentation, training people when you onboard them to deliver in a regularized way. Right? Now, I want to move on to possibly one of the more difficult words, platform. So we talked about products and services. What are platforms? It's a very vague term. I don't think it's easy to say that there is any way of standardizing what this term means. And this illustration here just shows us a number of different ways of interpreting this in different domains. So in product management, we probably tend to think about platform as being some sort of technical foundation for our product, whether that be hardware or software. And its role is to help us it's the platform on which we build modules and apps and products and so on. And some examples there of Amazon Web Services, for example, or Android. But if we go down a few lines down to marketing, for example, we might think about a platform as being a way of connecting different groups of users, right? So it's a different slant. Within a business, you might think about a platform as being some sort of strategic platform, a platform for growth and so on. So different cohorts within a business will usually have very different ways of thinking about these terms and what they mean. So you can't assume that somebody in marketing or sales or operations, or indeed your customer, will understand what you mean by platform. So I think you just need to elaborate that more, be clearer about that. Here's a nice little illustration that makes the point. If you're interested, I use something called Napkin AI to do this, which is a rather nice tool I discovered recently. It takes a bunch of text and it turns it into diagrams for you, right? So this is one of the ones that came up with, and I thought was rather neat. So on the right-hand side, we have business strategy concerns. On the left-hand side, we have technical architecture concerns. The top half is all the outward-facing concepts, and the lower half is the inward-facing concepts. And so there we are. So I come, as I say, from a technical background, so I tend to think of platform as meaning things like core technologies or APIs. So that might be things that support our own product development or things that we can give to our customers to help them to develop their own solutions. But on the right-hand side, it's just as valid to talk about things like customer-facing capabilities or organizational strategy, for example. So be aware of this, right? And remember, you have to be, if you work in product, you have to be a polyglot. In other words, you have to be able to speak these different languages and adapt as the context demands, right? As the situation demands. Here's a nice tool that I just want to call out a guy called Dilesh, who posted this on a very interesting article, I think about a year and a half ago. I referenced this when I did a talk on internal product management last year, a webinar on that. This is a roadmap tool for platforms, right? Which is, you can look at this at your leisure, but the reason we've got that circle there, because that's the time zones, right? The center circle is now, the next circle out is next, and the outermost circle represents the later, if you think about the Agile roadmap. But it's divided into product areas. So each of those 4 quadrants is a different area of the product, and the different colors on the sticky notes represent different themes. So the reason I put this up is because when we think about software platforms and product platforms, life can get difficult and complicated. And one of the big challenges I find is, how do you justify spend on platform? How do you account for the cost of platform? That story I told earlier about the tenant self-service product being sold for £2,500 instead of what it should have been was about over £100,000, and in the end it was. The reason it is so valuable is because of the 30 years of development that had already gone into the platform that it was sitting on, and it's easy to forget that when you are trying to evaluate a product that sits on a platform. So again, more for your own reference, there's a useful guide here as to different ways in which you can measure the value of platforms. So I just gave you an example. So the first bullet point there, linking the platform development to the value realized by customers. So this portal was worth millions to my customer, even though the actual bit of software itself had been developed by one guy in 6 months, right? But it was sat on a platform that had been developed by many hundreds of developer years, right? So remembering that bit changes the frame. So the table on the right shows a number of different metrics you might want to think about using to help you to evaluate platforms, and this can influence strategic decisions and also pricing for products that you sit on top of those platforms. Now, finally, the final term I want to look at is solution, another term that we hear a lot. Now, maybe you might hear this term most commonly in your sales team. I don't know. I mean, that's been my experience, right? That salespeople like to say, well, we're not going to talk about products, we're going to talk about solutions. Maybe they've been on a solution selling training course, and the book on the left there was a famous book by Michael Bosworth, who I think from about 1990, where he pushed this, or it might be a bit earlier than that. He was pushing this idea about problem-led selling, right? So rather than the guy on the right there who's just knocked on somebody's door and he has a gadget saying, look at this, do you want this? Instead of trying to push your product to people, you instead try to identify people who have the problem you can solve, right? And then get them to realize that you have a solution for that, right? So this is problem-led rather than product-led, right? Now, and I think this is important to understand this, right? Because this is, I think, having worked in sales for many years, I think this is by far the best way to sell products, and especially technical products, is by identifying pains and gains and trying to show how you can relieve the pains and create the gains and so on, right? But if that's just living on its own in the sales team and isn't connected to your product strategy, then again, some of those problems can arise that we talked about earlier. So, for you, I would leverage this and remember that one thing that sales is really different about sales and product, right? Is salespeople are incentivized to make sales to individual clients, right? They have a number to reach, and they're going to do that by getting enough customers to sign on the dotted line, right? To say yes to an individual deal. And so their focus is on one customer at a time. Whereas in product, we have to think about all the customers and all the potential customers. So we don't think just about customer problems, we think about market problems, right? So we're trying to solve a problem for many potential customers. And this means we have to do a lot of market research and develop strategy, as opposed to being reactive to individual customers. So we should listen to what individual customers say, but that just has to be placed in the context that they are just one organization or individual. So what is, I think it's a fair statement that buyers are looking for solutions, right? I'll talk more about this in a moment. Now, you've probably heard the saying, people don't want a 1/4-inch drill bit, they want a 1/4-inch hole. Now, this was famously attributed to Theodore Levitt, who was a professor at Harvard Business School and editor of the Harvard Business Review. But in fact, the saying goes back to the 19th century. But the point, Levitt did use this phrase, and the point he was trying to make was, when somebody buys a drill bit, it's not because they love the look of the drill bit. I mean, I know some people do that. If you on a Sunday at the nearby flea market, you'll see middle-aged men like me hovering over the second-hand tools, right? But most people buy a drill bit because they have a job to do, right? And this is the fundament of what's called the jobs to be done concept that was originally coined by Clayton Christensen, and has come to be a framework. So the idea being that if you understand what the job that the customer is trying to do, maybe it's to put up a shelf on a wall, they then face a problem, which is that the shelf needs to be affixed by drilling into the wall, putting screws into the wall, and the particular fixings they have require a hole to be drilled first, and therefore the problem is they don't have holes in the wall. And so your solution is a drill bit, a drill with a drill bit, right? But actually, this drill bit is a solution for other problems as well. So it might be also a solution for drilling a hole through a piece of wood so you can feed a cable through it, or various other hole making activities, or to drill out a broken screw where the heads come off the screw. So remember, it isn't necessarily a one-to-one relationship between products and problems, right? So a product may create many solutions, and a problem may also have many solutions, right? So solution is a linkage between product and problem, I would say. But sometimes it's hard to understand what the problem is. Now, this is arguably the world's most expensive handbag. All right, this is called the Hermes Himalaya Birkin, and you can pay up to $500,000 for one of these. That particular image comes from a website that was selling that one at £185,000. Now, why do people buy those? Right? Are we saying that The problem is that they need to carry their makeup, and therefore they need a £500,000 handbag. I doubt that that's really the problem they're trying to solve. It's probably more something to do with insecurity or needing to be seen to be successful or powerful, right? That's the problem it's really solving. A more kind of everyday example of this is a story that Clayton Christensen told about a famous fast food restaurant that he worked with. I think everybody thinks it's McDonald's, but I don't think he ever actually said which it was. But the problem they'd had was they'd been trying to grow sales of their milkshakes, and they just failed. They tried putting different flavors in and putting, and all sorts of different things. But so they didn't really understand why people were buying milkshakes in their drive-through. So when Christensen and his team interviewed a bunch of customers, what they really found was that primarily it was people who had a driving commute. They had a long commute, and it's boring sitting in a car for an hour and a half every day. And a milkshake was good because it would satisfy a bit of hunger. It would also last a long time. You can hold it with one hand. So really, it was a solution to the problem, I'm bored, right, as opposed to I'm thirsty or hungry. So that's why they didn't want, extra food to go with it, because they're going to be driving a car and they can't necessarily hold those things. So understanding what the problem really is crucial to getting the solution correctly aligned with the market. Now, to put all this together, this is a diagram that we use in our course, and I think it's a great way of explaining this. So what we like to say is that products and services, which they come in those different characteristics, and I should say a service, one of the characteristics of a service is that its value is consumed while you use it. So if you get a tire fitter to fit a tire to your car, that person can only be fitting a tire to your car. They can't be doing 3 cars simultaneously, right? So therefore you're consuming their time, unlike a product where you could sell me 1 million tires, right? So products and services deliver value to customers in the form of solutions, and you can think of a proposition as being a promised or a potential solution, and platforms are elements of your solution architecture that don't directly give value to your customers, but they support the products and services that do, and probably it's necessary for it to be there. So that image for me is a really neat way of just nailing these concepts. So finally, what can you do about this? I've just got a couple of slides to finish up. How can you actually sort this out and improve this in your business? Well, this is a diagram of what we would call product taxonomy. And this came from an actual client we worked with a number of years ago. And they had decided to organize the different elements, the different terms that they used in this way. So they had products and product components and product variants. And so they took time to discuss with each other, what do we mean by these things? And then they came up with they documented it in this taxonomy, which meant that they could avoid costly and wasteful errors in the future. It does look a little complicated, so I would encourage you to follow the KISS rule. Keep it simple, stupid, right? So it's rather than trying to over-engineer a concept that nobody will then be able to use or want to use, if you make it simple enough for people to find useful and intuitive, you've got a much better chance of actually driving adoption, right? And also, crucially, I would say, be consistent yourself. Don't be lazy with your own language. Don't say solution when you mean product, right? Or service, or product when you mean service. Because then if you're trying to preach to other people that we need consistency in our communications and you don't follow those rules, you can very quickly destroy any credibility that you have. Now, why should product people do this? Well, because we are very well connected. Now, these images come from a blog by Miro a couple of years ago, who analyzed a lot of data that they had about users, the companies they'd worked with. The one on the left shows a graph of connectivity between different roles, but they simplified it in the graphic on the right. And basically, the short story is that product people are more connected to the rest of the business than anybody else except the CEO, right? So in other words, you talk to everybody in the business typically. So to sales, to marketing, to engineering, to operations, to senior management, to customers, and therefore, the CEO doesn't have time to sort out this language problem. That they're too remote from it. So we need to do that in product. We're perfectly positioned to do this. We're at the center of things. Also, it will make your life a lot easier if you do. And we have, I think, when you learn about product and when you live in the product management world, you learn a lot of tools and concepts that will help you to get this right and to help your colleagues to adopt a common vocabulary, is the term that is a little more easy for people to live with, I think. So to finish up, the takeaways: words matter. I'm sure you've heard that expression before. Communication is arguably the essence of effective product management and business more generally. And these words do have important meanings. There are really distinct concepts, and it's important we can differentiate between them within in our world. And you're it. I don't think no one else is going to sort this out. It's up to you, and I think you'll make a good job of it. Wow, that's the end of my slides. Do we have any questions that have been popping up, Louise? Oh, before I get into that, yeah, sorry. I got ahead of myself. Before we get into the Q&A, just I've shown you a few slides there that we use in our training course, and some of these are also available in our toolbox. This is an amazing resource that we provide, high quality material online. So if you just go to productfocus.com and look for the toolbox on the main menu and log into that, sign up for that. You'll also get added to our mailing list, and we send out a lot of useful content as well. So we've built up a ton of stuff, and a lot of this is being regularly updated and refreshed as well. So knock yourselves out, guys. So on to the Q&A.
Okay, so we do have some questions. As expected, Aidan, they're mainly around platform, because I think products and services, I think people can get their heads around more readily. But this underlying platform has created a few questions. So I'm going to summarize a few questions all together. And basically, so what can you give us a better description of a platform where it is the underlying technology that enables your products and services?
Well, you said it. It's an enabler. All right. So I'm going to go back to, excuse me while I just go back to a previous slide. So I'll just pop that diagram up again. So this is, I think this will help me just to explain this. So the three boxes there, that's our estate, right? These are the things that we have defined and own, that are our intellectual property. Right? So obviously the products and services that we talked about, but the platform is it's part of our IP, right? So in a software environment, this might be a common database. It might be common functions and features that are necessary across the whole realm. So this might be things like authentication or the data architecture, for supporting things like business intelligence, right? So it is useful product. The reason why it's not in the product box and we call it platform typically is because it spans the whole realm, right? That it's general, that it's generally useful. So I've mentioned a few examples there. So things like authentication, security, or data services, or supporting different access, mobility, anything that is applicable to any of our products and services. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't directly deliver value, but what is usually the case in my experience is that the buyers they can't readily understand the value of this platform. It's hard for them to see why a secure login is a valuable thing to them, right? What they're really looking to buy are the things that these products do and that the services deliver, right? So this is often, the platform element is often defined more by the ability to articulate value to the customer as opposed to any kind of hard technical reasons. And it's typically because of its generality. So products tend to address specific solutions, platforms tend to address generic solutions. Is the simplest way I can put it, I think. What do you think, Louise? Did I deal with that one?
Yep, that sounds good to me. That's how I would have described it. Thanks, Aidan. I've got one more question because we're quite tight on time today. Just one more question around productizing services or managing services as products. Why would you do that?
Very simply, because it will cost you less to deliver the service, and therefore you can make more money, more profit, I should say. So, for example, in my last job, I worked in an agency. I mentioned that, and that's essentially what I did. Working in that company was to productize the service. So when I arrived, every client engagement was done in a different way, right? So there was a lot of reinventing of wheels, unnecessary learning curves. A lot of it was very hard to understand what was happening across the business because people were working in different ways. There was a lot of waste. So what we did was we identified what are the things that always need to happen, what are the things that shouldn't be happening, right? So part of productization is deciding what's in and what's out, right? So there were things that we were doing for customers that they asked us to do that we shouldn't really do, right? That perhaps wasn't actually that useful to the customer, right? Because we were just kind of taking their orders rather than necessarily doing, what was best for them. So this required a big shift away from the answer is always yes, which it was at the beginning. We moved to a position where we were consultative, where we worked with the customer to understand what their problem is, right, before we actually went ahead and started proposing solutions, right? So now the result of all of that was much more profitability, because it meant that it was much easier for us to deliver solutions. We wasted less time doing silly things. And also the customer understood the value of it more because it was solution focused as opposed to work focused, right? So, if you think, what's the value of having a tire on your car, right? That's a very different mindset to what's the value of somebody putting some rubber onto a metal rim, right? So, if you want to sell by outcomes, and thereby, very often you can achieve a higher price for that and higher margins. Then you need to be more deliberate about solving problems and following this product approach, rather than just being seen as a subservient service deliverer, right? So that's it, but it's about profit. So it's both about efficiency and about being able to sell to outcomes as opposed to delivering work. That's why.
Thank you, Aidan. We've come to the end of our webinar now. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. Thanks for listening. Next month's webinar is on the North Star framework. So the North Star metric, North Star framework. I'll be delivering that. Be lovely to see you there. And we'll be advertising it through the usual channels. But Aidan, thanks very much for today. And hopefully everyone else will see you another time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.